Hello and welcome to Riverland Women, the podcast which celebrates the amazing achievements and inspiring stories of women across South Australia's Riverland. I'm your host, Kerry Lush from the podcast station. I'm a freelance writer, podcast host and coach, and I'm a former ABC radio broadcaster. Join me each week as we meet some of the extraordinary women who call this region home. This is Riverland Women. When a swarm of bees infested her outdoor area at Renmark West, Kerry Chambers started researching what to do about them, and she soon became obsessed. It led her to starting her own beekeeping business, producing honey, managing hives, and educating the community about bees. Here's Kerry's story about how she became an accidental apiarist.
Career-wise, I trained as a teacher. I actually grew up in the Mornington Peninsula and then we moved around a lot because my dad worked for Australia Post. So I spent some time in Maclean near Grafton and then did most of my high schooling on the Gold Coast. Trained as a teacher up in Brisbane and moved to Mackay when I got my first job in North Queensland. And worked as a teacher. That year was fun, but Mackay's really small, and so I wanted something else. And at the time, my cousin said to me, she was living in the Adelaide Hills, and she said, "Come to Adelaide." She was pregnant with her first child, and she's like, "Come down here and help me." And I'm like, "All right." So I packed a bag, and rocked up with one suitcase and a guitar, and that was it. And I just loved Adelaide and spent all my time there teaching.
How did you end up here in the Riverland?
So my partner was a winemaker, so she was working out here at one of the big wineries here, and I guess we just had to make a decision because we got sick of the commuting, and it was much easier for me as a teacher to move my career to the Riverland than her. She's very much geographically bound to a wine region, so we ended up here. But we've been here over 10 years now, and we love it. I mean, it's a great place to bring up kids. The river's gorgeous. You know, the agriculture is great. It's been really good for us, the Riverland. We love it.
Did you start teaching here?
Yes. So when I first got to Adelaide, I was a fairly inexperienced teacher. I only had 1 year of teaching under my belt. So I was handing out my resume to just all local schools to see if I get some relief teaching. And this one particular school rang me up and gave me a day relief teaching. And I did my day and went into the lunchroom. And when I went into the lunchroom, all of these people were communicating with their hands. And I was like, oh, what's going on here? And most of the staff were deaf, and so they were communicating in Auslan. This particular school was a centre for deaf education, and so they were presenting the curriculum in English and Auslan simultaneously. So it was, mainstream classrooms, but there was up to, 4 or 5 kids in there that had a hearing loss that used Auslan to communicate. And so I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. And I just became really interested in it, learnt the language. So I went to TAFE and did the language and learnt how to sign and did my master's and became a teacher of the deaf. So I worked there for over 10 years. But then when I came out here to the Riverland, there wasn't a school like that here. So I did do some teaching at Glossop Primary School for a year, and then I stopped and had children, and then I went back and did some time at Renmark Primary, and then I now work in what's called support services. So we're a group of specialist teachers, I guess, that then go out and support our schools in the Riverland with kids who have additional needs. So for me, I work with teachers to help them come up with classroom accommodations and adjustments to support access for their kids in their class who have a hearing loss.
What was it about Auslan and working with children with hearing difficulties that really caught your attention?
I was just really fascinated. There was one student in particular who I still believe is phenomenal. She was her only barrier to learning was her hearing loss, and she grew up in a family that had a lot of deaf people in it, so she never had any break in access to language, I guess. So from birth, she had access to sign language, which is not always the case. When kids are born to hearing parents, there's often a delay in their parents learning the language, but she had it from the start. So she was very intelligent but profoundly deaf, so had never heard words like we hear them, but could read so well. And, you know, when you're teaching science concepts and math concepts, she just understood it. She just picked it up like that. And I was like, wow, like, I want to learn more about how we teach kids with this barrier to learning to achieve their goals like this girl was going to do. Like, it just, I was just blown away by her, and I said, I need to be a part of this.
It must be really rewarding work.
Oh, absolutely. Because, that kids with a hearing loss, like they're up against it, like even in social situations, making friends. I mean, this particular school was really good because everyone learnt the language. That was their lot. So lots of kids could communicate with the kids that were Auslan users. But, I mean, it's a challenge. We live in a hearing world. But, seeing them achieve their goals, make friends, become really capable community members, that is really rewarding.
You came to the Riverland, had a few different jobs, settled with what you're doing now, but then you started up a bit of a side hustle as well. Tell us a bit about Half Barrel Honey.
Yes, this is another little, I guess, serendipitous moment where, you know, I fell into the teacher of the deaf staff. So it's the same with the bees. Like, if you had have said to me, like, before I started that one day I'd be running a bee business, I would have gone, what do you mean? Because I actually grew up believing I was allergic to bees. I had a bee sting when I was a kid on my foot, and it blew up like a balloon, and the doctors had always said, well, you're allergic to bee venom. And so I was always very frightened of bees, had a healthy kind of regard for them. But a few years ago, my partner and I were actually travelling overseas, and we had my mum come and stay at our property here to look after, you know, the pets, chooks and a dog, and just look after the house. And it was then that this bee swarm came to our house. So in spring, bees split into two. So it's their natural way of reproducing and ensuring that their species lives on. But they split into two. And so one half of that colony is looking for a new nest. And on our veranda, we had one of those half wine barrels that people use as planters. Ours was empty, so we had it turned upside down, and we were actually using it as a bit of a side table to put our beer on of an afternoon. And this swarm came. Mum said she was sitting outside reading a book and she heard this really loud noise. I don't know if you've seen a swarm, but it's thousands of bees all flying around, a bit like a cartoon where you see just a black cloud of these tiny insects. And that's what it's like. And they're loud. And she said that she heard them and then saw them and raced inside and just sort of stood at the window and watched them. And she watched them, you know, one by one fly into the bunghole of that half wine barrel that we had upturned on the deck, and they were quite happy in there. So by the time we got back, which had been 2 weeks by this stage, they were well and truly happy in their little house. And I was like, oh my gosh, you know, I had a 9-month-old baby and we had this bee colony just outside our front door. It can't stay. So I got onto Google, started researching how to, you know, remove this bee colony, and came across all these videos on YouTube of people transferring bee colonies into actual hives and keeping them. And I'm like, oh, well, if they can do it, I can do it. Well, I've since learned it's not that easy, but I contacted a local beekeeper and he actually came and helped me transfer. Well, I didn't do it. I was still really frightened of bees. So he came and suited up, and I was standing behind the glass in my house watching from the safety of the protection of the house, watching him transfer these bees into a beehive. And I was just blown away. I was just like, this is really cool. And he took close-up photos of when he turned the barrel over, and just to see the amount of comb that those bees had built in that 2 weeks, I was like, wow, this is incredible. It's just really beautiful. But then, now I had these bees in a beehive. I actually bought a flow hive. I'm not sure if you've heard of those, but they're actually an Australian design. A father and son duo made up these special plastic frames that you essentially can turn a key and the honey flows out of the back of the hive. So I thought, okay, I'll buy that. So I bought that, and the bees went into that hive. And yeah, I had this beehive to then look after. So I got the suit, I got a smoker, I got a beehive tool, and just watched videos about how to look after this beehive. And, you know, as I said, like I had a 9-month-old baby and I wasn't working at all. So I was a stay-at-home parent looking after this baby. And as much as I love that, it's so repetitive. Like the days can be really boring, and, you know, feeding your baby too, there's a lot of time on the couch just sitting. And so any spare moment I had, I was reading about bees. I just became obsessed with bees. So that's how it started.
And then what came next?
So as I said before, like beehives, they want to split in two in spring. They split and they swarm. So the following season, I came home one day and there was this big ball of bees hanging in the tree. And I'm like, okay, well, I can't just let them fly away. I'll need to catch them. So I caught them, put them in a hive. So then that second year I had 2 beehives. And then, of course, the next season, both of those hives swarm. I came home one day and there's another hive I had to catch. Then a few days later, another hive I had to catch. So then suddenly I've got 4 beehives in the backyard. And I was like, holy dooly. And then, yeah, my friends started to, you know, catch on that I was interested in bees and I was keeping bees. And then when bee swarms ended up in their yard, they were calling me, Kerry, there's a swarm in my backyard. Can you come and collect it? I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. So then I had to, you know, order all these bee boxes to house all of these bees, because suddenly my backyard was covered in bee colonies. My partner's like, oh my God, how many more beehives are you going to set up in this backyard? Yeah, so it started taking up a lot of time because people would call me to get bees, and it was costing money too to buy all this equipment to house all these colonies. And then, of course, I had all of this surplus honey. I had way more honey than my family could eat. I was handing out all this honey, buying all the containers, and, you know, all that cost money. But everyone was benefiting from it. And I thought, well, I need to start selling this honey, doing markets and things like that. So that's kind of the first thing that I did, was to sell the honey. But then, like, when people were calling me all the time, can you collect swarms? I'm like, oh, you know, that's petrol to drive out there. It's my time to go and get them. Then I've got to look after this colony. I've got to feed them. I've got to house them. I thought, you know, I need to start charging people for this service and for my time. And I guess that's how it just kind of snowballed and evolved. Like, as people were asking for help for things, I was going, okay, well, that's a new service that I can add to my business. And then, yeah, just kind of building blocks, I guess, building on one thing after another. And yeah, so was born Half Barrel Honey.
And the accidental apiarist.
Absolutely, yeah. And to think that I was so frightened of bees, and still in the beginning when I'd put my suit on, I was so frightened of getting stung. But I can tell you, like, the anxiety of thinking about being stung is way worse than actually getting stung. Like, you have that bee buzzing around, you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get stung. That's worse than actually them stinging you, because it hurts for a minute and then, you know, you're over it.
So you're not allergic?
Well, no, I got stung on the neck in that first year, and I panicked a bit because I was like, oh my gosh, you know, I'm allergic to bees, bee venom, and I was kind of like waiting for something terrible to happen. It just never happened. And I've been stung on the face, and I did get a lot of swelling, but I think that's quite normal. But I'm just super careful now that I always wear my veil. I often work without gloves, but I find that when I get stung on my hands, I don't really get a reaction. I might get a little bit of swelling, but an hour or so later it goes down. But yeah, I'm just super careful about wearing my veil all the time, but I'm definitely not allergic.
Is the trick to try and get the stinger out as soon as you can? That's what I've always been told.
Yeah, that's right. So at the end of the stinger, there's a little sac that holds the bee venom, and it slowly will inject into you. So if you just got to like flick it rather than squeeze it, because if you squeeze it and try and pull it out, you're actually going to squeeze all the venom in faster. You need to use your fingernail and flick it off of your skin so that you don't get the full dose. Yeah.
You started with that one flow hive. How many hives, bee boxes do you have now, and how much of your, say, week does it take up?
So it fluctuates a little bit depending on, how many swarms I've caught and so forth. But I like to keep it around 20 to 25 hives. At the moment, I'm right on 20 hives. And so, with my teaching role, I do 0.5, so I do 5-day fortnights. And the rest of the time, I'm working on the bees. So, it's a 50-50 kind of split. And I could do more. Like, there's so much work to do with bees that I love. Like, I adore it. Like, it's certainly something that I look forward to doing. People that get into bees, I think, you can kind of set and forget, but there's actually a lot of hidden work associated with managing a beehive properly.
And what do you do with all the honey? Like, I'd imagine that 20 boxes or 20 hives would produce a fair bit of honey on an annual basis.
Yeah, so it fluctuates a bit. You're always relying on Mother Nature to put it on for you. So in a good season, you might get 2 boxes worth of honey. So in each super, you've got 10 frames, and each frame can hold around about 1.5 kilos to 2 kilos of honey. So from each box you can get 20 to 40 kilos in a good season. But the weather in the Riverland's been really up and down. We had that drought. That was really tough. There was 2 years there where I really didn't pull much honey at all out of my hives, because you've got to be really careful not to take all of the honey from the bees, because they actually make it for them, not for us. So you've got to make sure that they've got enough food to get them through the tough times. Only take surplus. And then we had the floods, and I thought, the floods might be good. Maybe there's lots of water around and we'll get lots of flowering. But we didn't. Like, the natives are really unpredictable. Like, sometimes they'll only flower every other year. And in the floods, I think maybe they got too much water and they all budded up, but they didn't burst. And so you're just really at the realm of Mother Nature, like waiting for her to put it on. So good seasons you can do really well, but then other seasons it can be quite tough.
Do you also hire out hives for pollination to the almond growers and stone fruit growers?
Absolutely. So in the Riverland we've got a really strong almond industry, and they're really reliant on bee pollination to get the nuts. So I hire out my hives. I've got a little small grower over at Paringa that hires my hives, but there's other growers, like pumpkin growers, like to have beehives. I've even done supported blueberry pollination under nets here in Renmark. That was really tough. It really knocks the bees around, because they rely on the sun in terms of their, navigation, like finding when they leave the hive, how they get back. They use the sun to get back, and when the nets are there, they struggle, like they get lost. And so you when I put them in, I'll leave them in for 2 weeks, and then when I pull them out, they're much lighter, because so many bee deaths, because they just couldn't get back. So they pollinate really well, but when they want to get back to the hive, they can't. So I've done that. Watermelons really benefit. So I do a bit of pollination, and I also have a program called Host a Hive program. So this is predominantly for people who in the Riverland have a bigger kind of patch, who might be keen growers, like have a little veggie patch or have a few fruit trees, and they want the benefits of the bee pollination. So they'll pay a monthly fee to have the hive there. So they can be completely hands off and just have the beehive there. I come and manage that hive. That's still my responsibility. I give them some honey, and they get the benefits of pollination. I also have some people that have gotten onto that program who are interested in starting beekeeping themselves, but it's still a little bit unsure. So they'll get at least one, and then they join me on the inspection. So I'll give them one of my spare suits. They'll put the suit on, and as we do the inspection, I'll talk them through, what I'm seeing, what's healthy, what's not healthy, and sort of teach them the ropes of beekeeping too. And then when they're confident enough, they come out of the program, and then they, get their own beehives. So I've got that. So there's about 10 hives in that program across the Riverland, just sitting in backyards from Waikerie all the way to Paringa. Yeah. So
you've managed to work your teaching in with your beekeeping.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I get the most joy, is when I mix those two, like use my teaching background and pass that knowledge on to other people. That's probably where I get the most joy out of my business.
And where do you sell your honey these days? You mentioned that you started with markets. Is that still one of the avenues you use?
Yeah, less so. I've got lots of stockists now in the Riverland. So a lot of the visitor information centres stock my honey for, visitors that are coming in and looking for local produce. Butchers like to sell honey, so there's a few local butchers, and just some other cafes have got my honey in their store. So, and I found that in the Riverland, people are really supportive. Like when other produce comes onto the market, people are really keen to showcase that, and I found it really easy to sell my honey because of that kind of supportive community that we've got here. So yeah, lots of places you can get it.
And I guess it's quite a shelf-stable product, so it can stay around for a while. Honey never goes off, does it? But it does crystallise.
That's right, no shelf life at all. It will last forever. But yes, it will crystallise, and you know that it's good honey if it does crystallise. So my honey is raw honey, so I don't heat it past 40 degrees. So the bees in the hive will keep the honey at 33 degrees. That's their favourite temperature. It's good for keeping the honey fairly liquid, and it's good temperature for rearing the baby bees. But then when you take out the frames and you sit it in your shed, particularly sort of in the cooler temperatures, it starts to cool down, and then it's really hard to extract. So I warm them back up, but I go as far as 40 but not over, because then once you heat it too much, you're actually killing all the natural enzymes in honey. Honey is actually really good for us. It has pollen in it, has propolis in it, has wax in it that are all kind of superfoods for our body. So you don't want to kill off that stuff. So you've got to keep it at 40 degrees. And the other thing I don't do is I don't microfilter the honey. So particularly honey in supermarkets that's mass produced, they need it to be filtered really well, because if you leave any bits of wax in there, it will crystallize faster. So they don't want that, because not a lot of consumers understand crystallized honey. They think it's gone bad, and so they won't buy it. So on the shelf, they want it to look liquid so that it will move. So they filter it really well and they heat it. So if you heat it and kind of pasteurize your honey, it's less likely to crystallize. It's something that consumers really need to look at, because if often the honey in supermarkets hasn't got any nutritional value because it has gone through that process. So always look at the label and look for raw honey, because that's what's got all that natural, microbial properties in there that are good for our health.
I've heard if you suffer from hay fever, you should eat the local honey or honey in your region to build up immunity to the pollens. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, they've actually done research on this, and studies have shown that if you're ingesting, and they say local because you want to get the pollen in your local area that's causing your hay fever. So if you start ingesting that in small amounts, then your body does become used to that pollen and stops having that major reaction to it. So yeah, so a spoonful of raw honey, local raw honey, will keep the doctor away, not so much the apple.
I wanted to go back to what you said about the bees keeping the hives the honey at 33 degrees. How do they manage that?
I know, that's the question, isn't it? When it's really hot, all the forager bees, so the bees that are on the task of collecting nectar and pollen from the environment, they will abandon that job and they will then all go and collect water. So they all go and collect water, they bring it back to the hive, they stand at the entrance of the hive with the water and fan their wings, kind of like air conditioning. They fan their wings over the water and it cools the hive down. If you think about the Riverland, we get really hot days. Recently we had a 44 degree day. Now that's really hard on bees because they have to work, that's 11 degrees that they've got to get that hive down. And also the wax will start to melt. So wax will start melting and getting soft and drop within the hive. So they've got to work really hard to keep it at that lower temperature. So that's how they cool it. In terms of warming it up, they use vibrations. So particularly in winter, and we have really cold winters, like the nights can get below zero here, they will essentially get into a big ball and they kind of do what penguins do to keep warm. They will take turns being in the center and they'll vibrate their body and create heat through vibrations, and then they'll just take turns rotating from the inside of that ball to the outside. So in and out, and just keep that heat going to keep themselves alive.
They are incredible creatures. I can see why you fell so in love with them and made it your daytime gig. There's been a lot in the news in recent times about the varroa mite around the Newcastle area and some parts of New South Wales. How big a concern is that for you as a beekeeper?
Yeah, it's another hurdle that you have to kind of jump over. There are lots of pests and diseases that can impact a bee colony that you always have to look out for. So it's something that takes time in your job because you're looking for those things, you're monitoring for those things. So this is just another pest that we'll continually have to monitor. But I guess the benefit that we have is that I believe we're the last continent to actually get this pest, that we can learn from other countries, particularly America. They've done lots of research about how to manage your hives, how to monitor your hives. So yeah, it's going to be another challenge. It's going to be more time that you need to spend on looking for something and testing for something. And there might be more colonies that we lose to it. I think it will impact a lot of hobby beekeepers because it'll just be another thing that they can't keep on top of. So yeah, it'll add an extra cost in managing. But yeah, I'm just trying to stay positive and think, right, well, we know what we can do because other countries have dealt with it, and just try and, take it in my stride. Like as soon as it gets here, I know I'm prepared.
What's next for Half Barrel Honey and for Kerry? Do you have a 5-year plan, 10-year plan? What do you think you'll do next?
I think I'd like to build on what you said before about education, like using my teaching skills and meld it with my knowledge of bees, because that is the time where I get the most joy. Like I've had groups come here, I've done beekeeping talks to community groups, like I had a car enthusiast group come through here as a tour, I had a women's group come through, I've spoken to garden clubs, they've come and listened to a talk about bees, I've had kids, the Year 7 ag class over at Wakery High, come out for an excursion and learn about bees. They've got one of my beehives there. And that's where, when I'm finished doing that, I feel like my cup is full, like I really enjoy passing on that knowledge. I'd like to do this again, where I've had a beehive out on the lawn and I called it a beekeeping tour, where people could come, not because you want to keep bees, but just out of interest, to put on a suit, open up a hive, hold a frame, have a look at the bees and have me talk them through what bee larva looks like, what a bee egg looks like, what the queen looks like. Just as a fun thing to do, something different for an hour on your weekend to come and see what it's like to open up a beehive. Yeah, and maybe do some more stuff with kids. I recently had a mum contact me and say, my son is super interested in bees. Is there any chance that you could show him one of your beehives? And so I suited him up in his little suit, and he was amazing. Came out and held the frames and looked at all the bees, and I really enjoyed doing that. So that's something that I'd really like to look at, is how can I grow my business by combining those two skills that I have to teach other people about bees and how amazing bees can be.
But also, I guess, to make a return on it as well. As you mentioned, it can be quite expensive, an expensive hobby, so you need some sort of return. Is that how you might manage it and balance it out?
Yeah, absolutely. So working out how I can use my skills to benefit my business and revenue to get the income coming in. Because there's a big misconception out there about bees. So often people will call me and say, I've got a swarm, can you come and remove this swarm? And I'll tell them yes, and tell them the fee that's involved in doing that. And often they're like, well, you can have the bees, like you're getting the bees for free. And I'm thinking, well, I get a bit frustrated, but I guess they don't understand that I then have to house those bees. I have to quarantine those bees to make sure that they don't infect, if they are infected, my other bees. I have to feed them. I have to give them a house, so that costs money. And I don't need bees. I propagate bees for a living. I've got bees coming out of my ears. I don't need to go and collect bees from the environment. I'm doing it as a service, because if you leave a swarm to fly off, they will most likely find an unwanted place to nest, and then it's much harder for me to cut out bees out of, say, a cupboard in someone's shed that they got into. That's hours of work, as opposed to an hour of work getting a bunch of bees out of a tree. That's much easier. So it's a responsible thing to do, is to collect swarms, not let them fly off and get into unwanted places, because ultimately if they get into a roof or a wall where you can't actually cut them out, often they're killed. So yeah, I guess that's a frustrating thing, just that misconception in the community about bees, that they don't want to pay that fee. They think they're doing me a favour by giving me bees, or yeah, it's not actually the case.
Your 2 children, how involved are they in the business? Do they like bees, honey? Do they pay much attention to what you do with it?
In the past, I have. My daughter has shown some interest, and I guess just being time poor before she started school, I was like, oh, I've got this bee job I've got to do, because I was rearing queens. So to make your own queens, you have to be really strict with your time. So if you don't do a certain job on this day at this time, you could lose all of your queens. So I'm like, oh, I haven't planned this very well, and I'd have to take her. And I'm like, right, you have to come and do this job with me. So yeah, they had their little bee suits. She'd put her bee suit on and just follow me around. But yeah, now that they're at school and there's less need for me to drag them along, they're quite happy to not be involved. But my son, funnily enough, well, not funny, it's terrible, he's got a bee allergy. He thought that one day it would be a good idea to lift the lid on one of my hives, and it was right on dusk, and I had a customer here picking up honey, and I think he was just showing off a bit. It was just out here where I had maybe 5 colonies just sort of sitting there, and he thought, I'm going to take the lid off of this, and yeah, they went for him. I saw him around there and I told him to move away, and he didn't listen. And so when he came running towards me screaming, my first thought was, well, there's your natural consequence. You've got a sting. As he ran past me, I looked at his back, and he had about 20 or so bees on his back, stinging, like trying to, curled over, trying to sting him. So I'm like, oh, here we go. So yeah, visit to the hospital, and now has an EpiPen, and yeah, he's actually he's going to start his desensitization this week, which is a bit of a process. But that was a huge challenge, because then I had to move all of my hives off the property, so keep him right away from them. And even when I get in the car, I've got to make sure I do not have one bee on me. And if I'm driving along and I can hear a bee in the car, I have to pull over and find that bee and let her out. So yeah, I'm super hyper vigilant now about stray bees following me. So that's a huge challenge. But they know a lot about bees, and they certainly love honey. They have honey on their wheat bix every morning. But they know a lot about bees, but not so much involved anymore in the suits.
Not when it's life-threatening.
No. Oh, gosh.
Oh, well, Kerry, thank you so much for having a chat to me on Riverland Women.
No, thank you. It's been great.
That was Kerry Chambers from Half Barrel Honey at Renmark West. You can follow Kerry at Half Barrel Honey on Facebook and Instagram. You can also follow Riverland Women and the podcast station on those platforms. And if you haven't already, I'd love it if you could subscribe to this podcast. Just hit that little button on the top right where you see the Riverland Women page. It's completely free, and it means you'll never miss an episode. Also, if you've enjoyed what you've heard so far, don't forget to leave a review. Thank you for listening to Riverland Women.